Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tamara Rosevan. In late March, the Canadian government said it was not actively considering supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine for free. Instead, Ottawa pledged to continue support for the Operation Unifier program and to allow the export of firearms, weapons, and other equipment in certain cases. My guest today to talk about Canadian support for Ukraine is James Bezan. He's a Conservative Member of Parliament. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the show, Tamara.
Yeah, so in a report, the Standing Committee on National Defence, it recommended that Canada provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, but the Canadian government responded with, quote, "We're not actively considering the provision of lethal weapons in the form of military-to-military donations." Now, would you say that that's a definitive no?
It certainly sounds like a definitive no, and I can tell you that as the Vice Chair of the Standing Committee on National Defence and the Shadow Minister for Defence for the Conservative Party of Canada, I can tell you that this is disheartening, to say the least. As Conservatives under Stephen Harper, we've provided all sorts of equipment as well as started Operation Unifier for Ukraine. And we also know that the Liberals have been slow in renewing that mission. They finally did. They aren't interested in renewing the Youth Mobility Agreement or extending visa-free travel to Ukrainians to Canada to help facilitate the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, which was started under Prime Minister Stephen Harper and finished by the Trudeau government. But we believe as Conservatives that we need to do more for Ukraine, which includes supply of lethal defensive weapons so Ukraine can protect and secure its territorial integrity as well as protect its sovereignty.
I see. Now, I've been to the Yavoriv Training Center where over 200 Canadian troops are stationed to help train Ukrainian soldiers. And one of the things that I heard was that the Ukrainian armed forces, they lack middle management experience. And this is something that you mentioned as well in the report of the Standing Committee on National Defence. And it was a key point, and it's something that I've heard, but it seems that it's also a key issue for the Canadian government. Do you think that when Canadian lawmakers will look at different cases of whether to provide Ukraine with certain types of weapons, do you think they take into account these things that are being reported back to them from Canadian military officers and the Canadian military mission here in Ukraine?
Well, we do believe that the work that we've been doing as the Canadian Armed Forces in training the Ukrainian military is showing that the Ukrainian military is very capable. One of the concerns that we did have is that there isn't a lot what we call the middle management, which is the non-commissioned officers, which is common among NATO allies. And as Ukraine works towards their NATO aspirations of having membership within NATO, as they're working towards making sure that they put in place all the reforms that's required by 2020, which we're helping with through the appointment of Jill Sinclair to the Defense Advisory Board, to the Minister of National Defense in Ukraine, General Poltrak. As we continue down this path, we'd like to see the ability to interoperate with Canadian and other NATO armies. And the way you do that is to mimic the way that those militaries are structured, which includes having a lot of non-commissioned officers that take up the middle management levels so that you're not as top-heavy with a lot of generals and colonels and majors, and that you have more, sergeant majors, you have a lot of master corporals and more of those types of officers in your corps to help with your infantry and your enlisted military members.
Now, that's an interesting point, but Ukraine has also been included on the automatic firearms country control list, and there are all kinds of different interpretations of that, of what kind of weapons will be provided, can be provided. Can you help set the record straight, and can you tell us about some of the types of weapons that Ukraine will be able to purchase for sure? Say, will Ukraine be able to purchase rockets or anti-tank weapons, something that Ukraine has been seeking from its Western partners, and say mortars, heavy caliber guns? Is that on the table?
Well, as conservatives, we believe that all those should be on the table. I can also tell you that we've lobbied quite strongly, and we're glad to see after the committee report came out that the government of Canada did add Ukraine to our automatic firearms country control list so that they can buy company military to any Canadian company to get the weapons that they require. I know that Ukraine has been very interested in sniper rifles, as an example, and any of our machine guns that we manufacture here in Canada. I know that there's also been interest from Ukraine in some of our light armored vehicles, our LAV-6s in particular. And I know that those are things that we'd like to see done as export opportunities for Canada. Definitely would strengthen Ukraine's military, would provide increased protection to those Ukrainian forces that are fighting in Donbass today, and will increase the ability for them to protect citizens in that region. So we do believe that there should be those opportunities and they should be pursued. And I'd like to encourage the government of Canada to actually do that. But we also, at the same time, still believe that the government of Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces should look at providing some of our excess weapons to Ukraine, which includes anti-tank missiles. Again, it's about providing the capabilities to the Ukrainian forces for them to be able to not just hold the line, but to defend Donbass and restore their territorial integrity.
I see. Now, Ukraine is also among dozens of other countries on this firearms country control list. Among them is the U.S. and the U.K., Canada's biggest partner, the U.S. Do you think that the same rules apply in terms of weapon sales when it comes to Ukraine and, say, the U.S.? Would Canada consider selling the same types of weapons, say, that they would to the U.S., the same to Ukraine would be sold?
Well, everything's going to be considered on a case-by-case basis. I'll tell you one thing that I'd be interested in seeing, and as an example, some things that we do with the United States, is that in some of the advancements of things like electronic warfare and cybersecurity and providing better equipment, I think that there's an opportunity for partnership between the government of Canada or Canada's defense industry with the Ukrainian defense industry, particularly those that are building tanks and armored vehicles, to ensure that the electronic equipment that's being put on those tanks are capable of withstanding any type of electronic warfare or cybersecurity attacks that could occur from the Russian forces or Russian proxies.
I see. Now, one of the kind of points that I think a lot of Ukrainian lawmakers were quite disappointed to hear were on cybersecurity and fighting propaganda. In the National Defense report, in the committee's report, I believe you guys were asking that more assistance be provided in this area. But it seems that Canada is not considering providing Ukraine with cybersecurity personnel to assist with cyber defenses. Is this alarming? Should Ukraine be worried? Why do you think the Canadian government is not interested in helping Ukraine in this area?
I'm actually very baffled by the response from the government on that particular recommendation. What we saw in Ukraine is that Ukraine is the front line, learning as we go on what's happening in the whole realm of hybrid warfare. Russia is testing out all their new battle techniques in Ukraine. And so it is in Canada's best interest that we are not only assisting Ukraine in standing up their military to take on this threat, but it's also an opportunity for Canada and our NATO allies to learn of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine today. So we'd love to see Canadian personnel serving side by side in a hybrid unit to deal with things like cyber attacks, how we implement things like not just cyber defense, but cyber warfare and take the offensive back at the foe. So in Canada right now, we're going through a whole process of standing up our own cyber units to deal with cyber warfare and to make it so it's a specialized trade within the Canadian Armed Forces. But at the same time, it would be good for us to be cooperating and standing jointly with our friends and allies in Ukraine.
I see. Now, intelligence sharing, that wasn't even something that was mentioned in the National Defense, in the Committee on National Defense's report. Now, is that completely off the table? Is that something that has never been even on the Canadian government's agenda?
Well, I can tell you that when we were government under Stephen Harper, that we were doing more than just sharing intelligence. We were actually sharing satellite images through our RadarSat constellation to ensure that Ukraine knew exactly what was happening at the border and what was happening in Donbass, not just by the Russian proxies, but what troops and heavy equipment and artillery was moving back and forth over the border. And we were freely sharing that intelligence with the government of Ukraine. And President Poroshenko has asked for that to be reinstated since the Trudeau government canceled that program over 2 years ago. So it's something that, as Conservatives, we felt strongly about. The Committee on National Defense also said that we should reinstate this provisions of RadarSat images, as well as continue with intelligence sharing, so that as we're collecting intel as part of Canada's intelligence community, that we would share the relevant information as it relates to the war in Donbass and Russia's continued aggression with the Ukrainian armed forces, so that you're able to make the appropriate changes to the daily routines and protect Ukrainian soldiers as well as Ukrainians that are in harm's way.
I see. Now, what do you think needs to change, or which changes should the Ukrainian government make within its defense system or defense sector for Canada to be ready to provide military-to-military donations when it comes to lethal weapons? What policy changes should the Ukrainian government make before Canada considers this?
Well, first I'll say, as a legislator, someone who's very familiar with Ukraine and Ukraine's armed forces, and someone that has been over there many times, both in government and as a member of the opposition here in Canada, I can tell you that the reforms that are happening in Ukraine are happening at an incredible rate and pace. And I know that sometimes people in Ukraine get a little frustrated that it's not happening fast enough, but to change the motion of government is one of the most challenging things for any government, whether it's in Ukraine, Canada, or elsewhere. So the reformation that's taken place so far has been very impressive. But I can tell you that also there's still that ongoing concern about the issues of corruption within government departments, including the Department of National Defense in Ukraine. There's still the concern about whether or not reforms are happening fast enough for civilian oversight to ensure that Ukraine's military is operating and the Department of Defense is operating very similar to what happens in the rest of the NATO membership. And I think that as those reforms take place, as we approach 2020 and hopefully ascension into NATO sometime shortly after that for Ukraine, then I think that we'll be looking at an opportunity to provide intelligence under NATO rules, to provide lethal weapons under NATO rules. I think that's the way the Liberal government here in Canada was looking at it. But I can tell you, as Conservatives, we'll continue to call for that to take place now, sooner than later. Ukraine is the front line in Russia's war and their imperialistic ambitions. And the only way that we stop Vladimir Putin is that we have to stop what he's doing in Ukraine now. And that means that we provide more support, not less, but more support to the people of Ukraine.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Tamara.
That was James Bezan. He's a Canadian Member of Parliament within the Conservative Party. We've been talking about Canadian support for Ukraine. You're watching UATV.